Welcome back to the 6 days of Genesis. We're going through, in 6 sessions, the 6 days of Genesis. We're looking at Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Now, we've done this in a slightly unusual way. We haven't done 1 session per day, and there's a reason for that. We've reserved 2 sessions at the end for day 6. In our first session, we looked at the whole business about why there are 6 days of creation. And we said that it was very, very important to believe that God had created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. We also showed that you could calculate from the Bible that the world was created about 6,000 years ago. If you may remember, at the end of that session, we quoted Martin Luther. When Martin Luther was confronted with a similar group of people as we have today, people who didn't want to believe that the 6 days were literally 6 days, he said, well, basically, to paraphrase him a little bit, he said, well, if you can't believe that the 6 days are literal 6 days, at least grant that the Holy Spirit has more wisdom than you do. And that's the important point. The Holy Spirit, in inspiring Scripture, told us that God created the world in 6 literal days. Who are we to start to change that? So that was the substance of the first talk. In the second talk, we looked at the first 3 days of creation, saw that God had created light. In fact, on the first day, he created all the material of the universe, and in particular, he created light. On the second day, he had separated water from water as he created the expanse of the universe and spread the universe out. And on the third day, he gathered the seas into one place, so we had the land and the sea, and we had plants being made. And we talked a bit about plants and how God had created plants according to their kind, where their seed is in itself. And we started to look at how we can analyze these sort of scriptural statements from a scientific point of view. We're not allegorizing them in any way. We are saying that Scripture gives us a different way of classifying things, which may sometimes be similar to the evolutionary method of classifying things, but not necessarily. We are not going to be afraid to classify things differently because God has created them in a particular way. In our third session, then, we looked at day 4 of creation. We talked about the Bible's astronomy. We talked about the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. One of the things that we pointed out in that session is that actually Genesis does not name the sun and the moon. And the reason for that is that the Bible is emphasizing to us that the sun and the moon are created things. The worship of the sun and the moon is widespread throughout the world. That does not mean that Genesis 1 is simply written as a polemic against the pagan worship of the sun and the moon, as some people say. It's an actual historical event. But of course, because it's an actual historical event, it speaks against the worship of the sun and the moon, in the way that we read in Romans 1, where people were criticized because they had ceased to worship the Creator and instead worshipped created things, such as the sun and the moon. That was our third session then on day 4 of creation. Our fourth session was on day 5 of creation, and we looked at sea creatures, and flying creatures. We talked about the fact that the flying creatures, the fowl, are really all sorts of flying creatures. So we're talking about flying insects, we're talking about birds, we're talking about bats, we're talking about probably pterodactyls as well. We also looked at sea creatures. One of the things that we mentioned in that session is that we saw that there's a complete difference, many, many points of difference between the evolutionary order of things and the biblical order of things, so that you cannot simply say that we will smash evolution into the Bible and we will believe both. It doesn't work. You can't believe both because they are contradictory to each other. The Bible contradicts evolution, for example, by saying that whales were created before land animals, whereas evolution says that land animals came before whales. And these things just don't tie together. So in this section, our 5th section, we've reached day 6, and you might think we've got a session to spare. But we haven't. The reason why, when we're talking about creatures of land, that we're going to talk about this for 2 sessions, is that a lot of things happened on day 6. And I simply can't fit everything that happened on day 6 of creation into one session. There's a lot to say. Let's start with what the Bible actually says then in Genesis 1 verses 24 and 25. We read, "And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind, livestock and creeping things, beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." There's a rule in interpreting the Bible which says that if something's being repeated, it probably means that it's very important. It's really God's method of underlining something to us. You know, if you think something's important, when you go through a textbook, you probably get a highlighter pen out and you go over it, or you underline it. As I was taught to do when I was at school, you were supposed to get out a ruler and a pencil and underline it very, very neatly, because we were told off if it was underlined in a mess. It all had to be done absolutely carefully and very, very neatly. In the Bible, that underlining is frequently done by repetition. So what have we got here? Well, the first thing that's being repeated is that the creatures we're talking about are living creatures. They are creatures, in other words, they've been created, and they are living creatures. The word living is the word nephesh. And you may remember that at the end of the last section, we touched on the subject of nephesh. Let's remind ourselves a little bit about what the word nephesh means. In fact, when we looked at the sea creatures and the flying creatures, we found that God had blessed those animals. The blessing isn't specifically mentioned here for the animals of day 6. The blessing is only specifically mentioned for the creation of man later in the chapter. Nevertheless, the blessing is actually implied simply by the sort of language that's being used. And again, we need to emphasize that these particular living creatures that are being mentioned here are nephesh creatures. Nephesh creatures. Living creatures. Nephesh, we said, it occurs a lot in the Old Testament. In particular, we find that it's mentioned in the book of Leviticus, where it says that the life of the flesh, the nephesh of the flesh, is in the blood. The life of the flesh, the nephesh of the flesh, is in the blood. So we're talking about animals that contain blood. The second thing that we need to notice here from this passage is that we are referred to the kinds of animals frequently. These living creatures are brought forth according to their kinds. And you can see the phrase according to their kinds occurring several times in that one short passage. So again, by this rule of repetition, the idea of kinds must be important. I'm going to leave the idea of kinds on its side for a minute. We touched on it briefly in the last session, but I'm going to go into a lot more detail today. The third thing I want you to notice is that there are 3 classifications of animals here. And this is where I need to emphasize that the Bible's method of classification is not the same as the evolutionary method of classification. You see, the Bible is classifying these animals not according to whether they're reptiles or mammals or whatever, but according to their use, if you like, or their behavior patterns. So that there are livestock. Now that's translated as cattle in some versions, and that's important. I think it's probably a good idea to use the word livestock rather than cattle, because we're referring to things that are far broader than merely cows. And by cattle, I tend to think these days of cows and bulls, you know, that particular type of animal. The bovine animal is what I would tend to think of as cattle. But you see, in 1611, the word cattle was broader. And that's why the word livestock is probably a better word for us to use today, because we're referring then to any domesticated or animal that is capable of being domesticated. It wasn't domesticated when God created it, but it's an animal that tends to be of use, therefore, to people. Creeping things, we're not really talking about insects at that point. In fact, it doesn't matter that the Bible doesn't specifically talk about the creation of insects. You'll see why in a moment. God certainly made insects. He made all sorts of creatures, but it doesn't specifically name things. It may include insects, but I think it's probably more specifically referring to reptiles and amphibians, because these are nephesh animals. They're animals with blood, so it's probably referring to reptiles and amphibians. And finally, we've got beasts of the earth. So we've got those three classifications. Beasts of the earth, we're referring then to wild animals. Wild animals. Now, those living creatures, as we've said, are living and breathing. So nephesh implies breathing as well as implying life. We know that the life of the flesh is in the blood, but the word actually implies breathing. The point that animals have blood in them is very important. Noah was going to have to take onto the ark later on animals in whom was found the breath of life. Now, we know then that this breath of life probably implies that we're talking about animals that had lungs. And these are animals that have blood in them. We read in Leviticus that the life of the flesh, the nephesh of the flesh, is in the blood. So this is an extremely important point. How did these so-called primitive people know that there was a connection between blood and breath? We know today that blood is necessary in order to take the oxygen from the lungs to all the various different parts of the body. How did these so-called primitive people know that? Because they weren't primitive and because God designed this whole system. It all came from the work of God himself. Now, what we then go on to see is that God made these animals so that they could speciate. Now, this is important because we introduced in our last section the concept of speciation and the concept of baraminology. And I really want to expand on that. Baramin, we said, is from a word, is from the Hebrew words bara, meaning created, and min, meaning kind. So it is the science of the created kind, and it is basically creation sciences biology. We're classifying things in a different way. Now, how do we know if animals are in the same created kind? Well, the answer is this: because speciation is going to happen by natural selection of existing genetic information within these created kinds. So we can see that animals can develop within those kinds. The example that we could use here would be something like cats, for example. Cats that we have today have almost certainly developed from the cats that Noah took on the ark. There would have been cats before the flood as well, but the cats we have today would have developed from those on the ark. Noah didn't take 2 lions and 2 tigers and 2 leopards and 2 jaguars and so on. He took 2 of the cat kind, from which all cats today have developed by speciation. So they are within the same kind. Now, how do we know that they're in the same kind? The answer is that we don't always know that they're in the same kind. And this is where there is a lot of research to be done. This is why creation scientists are still doing research. And that's fair enough. After all, evolutionary biologists are doing their sort of research, which is usually based on fairy tales and conjecture and imagination. But creation scientists are doing real research. There are a few things we can say about animals that are within the same baramin. For example, we know that 2 animals are almost certainly within the same baramin. Well, I think we can pretty much say for definite they're within the same baramin if you can interbreed them, if you can hybridize them. For example, you know that it's possible to hybridize a lion with a tiger. It doesn't happen in the wild, but it can happen in zoos. You know, if they've kept a tiger and a lion in the same enclosure and they're opposite sexes, you can get an offspring from those. They're within the same kind. So the existence of hybridization proves that those animals are within the same kind. You've got other examples of that. It is perfectly possible to make a hybrid between a camel and a llama. So we know that camels and llamas are within the same kind, because you can get a hybrid. We know that llamas and alpacas can interbreed, so we get hybrids of those. So llamas and alpacas are within the same kind. But Camels and alpacas do not interbreed. You cannot get a hybrid of those. So just because you can't get a hybrid doesn't mean that they're not in the same kind. After all, if camels and llamas are in the same kind, and llamas and alpacas are in the same kind, then surely camels and alpacas are in the same kind. It's all the one kind, the camelids. So, although I'm saying that you can prove scientifically that two animals are within the same kind if you can hybridize them, if they don't hybridize, that does not mean that they're in different kinds. They might still be in the same kind. There could be more research needs to be done, perhaps even on a molecular level, looking at the actual genetics of the DNA and a lot more research. So there's a lot of research for creation scientists to do, and there's a lot of things that we don't know yet. It's likely, for example, that water buffalo in Africa are related to American bison and possibly in the same kind, but you don't get hybrids between them. On the other hand, we know a more famous example is that you do get hybrids between different kinds, different animals within the horse kind. Everybody's familiar with mules, hybrid between horses and donkeys. So what have we got here then? We've got the fact that you can get different types of hybridization, different types of speciation. Speciation is not evolution. We need to hammer that point home. Speciation is an observed fact. You can see it happen. You can see new species developing. But that is not evolution because it's within the same kind. Evolution implies that new genetic information is spontaneously generated. Now, you've got to be careful with our definitions because so many people use very loose definitions. Evolutionists use loose definitions all the time. In fact, if you look on Wikipedia, that fount of all knowledge, as we've often said, you'll find that their definition of evolution is, they say it's a change in allele frequency, type of, it's a genetic term, it's a change of allele frequency. Well, that covers a huge number of things. And that enables them to say that just because they observe, say, variation within the cat family, that therefore they can say that cats and dogs have a common ancestor. But that doesn't make sense. It doesn't happen. It's not the same thing. Variation within the kind does not prove evolution, but evolutionists pretend that it does. Evolution, therefore, true evolution that requires new genetic information is not observed and is in fact impossible. And I said we'd say it's impossible, why it's impossible, and briefly it's because information cannot just come about from nowhere. Information needs an information giver. Information is not actually part of the material on which it appears. An example of that would be if you were to put a blank CD down on the desk and leave it for an hour or two, you wouldn't expect to be able to come back and find that it had magically developed a copy of Microsoft Windows 7 on it. That simply wouldn't happen. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you can't get the information from Windows 7 onto a CD. You'd probably have to have some sort of clever copying program, particularly to overcome the various codes that are in there. Or maybe you could be clever enough to program the CD yourself and put all the information in there. After all, there must be a lot of clever programmers like that around. They keep saying that people keep coming on TV and saying, I'm a PC and I created Windows 7. So there seems to be an awful lot of them around. But the whole point is that the information does not arise on the CD by itself because the information is not part of the CD. It's not inherent in the matter. There is no difference in the actual material between a CD containing Windows 7 and a CD which is blank. There's no difference in the actual material. The difference is in the information. So the information is not a property of the matter. In fact, to actually get information to arise spontaneously, which is what you would require for evolution, it would need to just appear from nothing in the matter, and that is actually impossible. It simply cannot happen. That, of course, may be the last occasion on which you'll hear Microsoft Windows referred to as an example of intelligent design. Well, baraminology has many examples that we could look at. For example, rabbits do a lot of breeding. A lot of breeding. In fact, they breed like rabbits. And you get different kinds of rabbits. And I went into one of the local pet shops not so long since, and I saw lots and lots of different kinds of rabbits. And they get different sizes of them. The ones that intrigue me the most, I haven't seen them over here. I don't know whether you've ever seen them on television or not, but you have them in Britain sometimes. The Dutch giant rabbits. Have you ever seen those? The Dutch giant rabbits. They're amazing. They're huge. You know, they are about this big. They are enormous. There was a German breeder of these Dutch giant rabbits, and he sent 6 of them for some reason. I do not know why, but he sent 6 of them as a gift to Kim Jong-il, the dictator of North Korea. And Kim Jong-il actually sent a thank you note back to say, thank you for these rabbits, they were delicious. Rabbits can be changed in all sorts of varieties. But at no time will you get one like that. It doesn't happen. Because you don't get that sort of variation. Horses, we've already said, you get lots of different varieties of horses within the same kind. It's interesting that you see in some museums and some textbooks the evolution of the horse, starting with the Eohippus and getting gradually bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually you get to the size of a modern horse. But how big is a modern horse? The Caspian pony, for example, is not actually a pony, it's a true horse and is very small. It's the size of a pony, which is why they call it a pony. A Shire horse, on the other hand, is large. So today you have various sizes of horses. So how can you say that horses have gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger as they've evolved? It doesn't make sense. In fact, even evolutionists don't like the linear picture of horse evolution, and yet most textbooks still have it in. It's a nonsense, by the way. You ought to point that out when you see that in textbooks. Any of you young people, if you see that in a textbook, you ought to be pointing that out to your teachers, that even evolutionists don't believe that. You'll find it on the BBC's website, by the way. The BBC's website, you know the BBC, don't you? You heard of the BBC here, haven't you? The Babylon Broadcasting Corporation. You know that they have a section on there for school children in Britain to help them with science exams and revision. And if you look up evolution, you'll find that they say that the best example of evolution is the horse. And they show the diagram. It's a nonsense. But even though you get different varieties of horses, different breeds of horses, and of course donkeys and zebras, you won't get one of these ever. That doesn't happen. Dogs, you will get different breeds of dogs, and you'll get different varieties of dogs. Lots and lots of different varieties of dogs. I could show you hundreds of pictures of dogs, foxes, coyotes, dingoes, all sorts of different types of wild dogs. I can show you different breeds of domestic dogs, Labradors, German Shepherds, Australian Shepherds, Shetland Shepherds, Labradors, Poodles, Yorkshire Terriers, Pit Bull Terriers, loads and loads of different types of dogs. They're all within the dog kind, and they've all developed probably from wolves, because the wolves would probably be the highest form of the dog kind that's got all the genetic information in, and all the others have developed from that. You might eventually get a dog looking like, say, a Chihuahua, which is almost not a dog, but is a dog, just about has the genetic information of a dog. But at no time will you ever get one of those. Or one of those. It simply doesn't happen. You see, it's all down to genetics. It's all down to genetics. This business of speciation is down to genetics. Within the kinds, these creatures have developed from animals that have a wide variety of genetic information, and they've gradually been selected, and that selection process has gone down and down and down, because at each stage of selection you have lost information. Speciation, therefore, is about decreasing information. So, for example, you might start from wolves and you might end up with a Yorkshire Terrier. You start from high information, you've ended up with lower information. That's speciation. Evolution, on the other hand, is increasing information, starting from an amoeba and ending up as a human being. The top one is what you observe all the time. Speciation happens. We see that decreasing information all the time. Selection from existing information. The bottom one never happens. You do not ever see increasing information, and it's impossible because it would break the laws of information science. Even evolutionists actually know this. For example, in this particular book about canine evolution, it's interesting that this particular writer says that all dogs come from the same stock. They haven't come from cats, they haven't come from elephants, they've come from dogs. Dogs have changed into dogs. That is not evolution, it's just dogs. And it's just amazing the way that people do things and the way that people see things. You see, if you start with dogs, you will end up with dogs. You can imagine that the wolves getting off the ark, breeding, and more dogs and large numbers of dogs until eventually you've got huge numbers of dogs. But a little bit of simple genetics will tell you that the selection process actually removes information. I need to explain a little bit of simple genetics, really. Supposing you've got a pair of medium-haired dogs. They've got medium length hair, not short, not long. This might be due to the mother dog having within it pairs of genes where one gene is a gene for long hair and the other gene is a gene for short hair. And the father dog the same, one gene being a gene for long hair, one being a gene for short hair. When they mate, there's going to be from each pair, from each parent, one gene passed on to the offspring. So clearly it could be one long-haired gene and one short-haired gene passed on from both parents. But equally, it's perfectly possible that the offspring could have taken one short-haired gene from the mother and one short-haired gene from the father. It then would end up with two short-haired genes, so it would have short hair. Or similarly, an offspring could have a long-haired gene from the mother and a long-haired gene from the father, so that you would have two long-haired genes, which means that the offspring would have long hair. Now couple that then with the environmental changes. Supposing that some of the dogs getting off the ark are migrating southwards to where it's hotter, for example, maybe they've gone to Africa. Which particular type of dogs, the length of hair of dogs, are going to survive best in those hot conditions? Well, it's likely to be the short-haired genes. It's likely to be the dogs with short hairs. So what happens is then that the next offspring will be offspring of a short-haired dog and a short-haired dog. Both mother and father have two short-haired genes in order to have short hair, so the only possibility is that they're going to pass on short-haired genes. The offspring will all have short hair. There will be no long-haired dogs offspring from those particular ones. Now clearly the situation's a little more complex than that, but on that simple level you can see that a new species may begin to develop, but it's only selecting from existing information. The information was already there, so that is not evolution. It's the development of new species. In a similar way, there might be long-haired creatures, long-haired dogs, surviving better in the north of Norway for exactly opposite reasons, but that is not evolution. It's selection from existing information. No new information has been produced. Well, let's just move on. In Genesis chapter 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." The importance of this verse is it tells us something about the relationship between people and the world that we live in, and particularly the other animals. There was a fairly well-known song a few years ago that had a line in it that said, "People are just animals." Now, the reason for that, I suppose, is because in some ways we look like animals, but that's naturally going to be the case because God has created us to live in the same world, in the same sort of environment, and to eat the same sort of food as animals. But in actual fact, we are completely different from animals because people are specially created and made in the image of God, and that is not something that's said about animals. Not only are we in the image of God, but also we were created to be given dominion over the animals. And that dominion is actually controversial. For example, the British broadcaster and naturalist David Attenborough, he's the brother of the actor and film director Richard Attenborough. In Britain, David Attenborough is actually more well known than Richard Attenborough, and he did a lot of documentary programs for the BBC, which are beautiful documentary programs. Films of, he's done this over decades, films of wildlife in different parts of the world. And I would love it if we were allowed to use his documentaries and turn the sound off and put our own narration on them. Of course, you can't do that for copyright reasons, and the narration is just sheer nonsense. And this is what he says, because he really is very anti-Christian. And as he's getting older, he's in his 80s now, he's getting more and more anti-Christian all the time. And he says this, for example, he blames everything in the world, pollution and climate change, which is something I'm really not going to get into at the moment, but it's interesting to look at what the Bible says about climate change and global warming and so on. But he thinks that that's a problem. Okay, he thinks that's a problem, and he blames it on this verse in Genesis. This is what he said. The influence of the book of Genesis, which says, the Lord God said, go forth and multiply, to Adam and Eve, and the natural world is there for you to dominate. I didn't read that, by the way, in the Bible. Did you read that? He's changed it. He's changed it a bit. The natural word is there for you to dominate, is that you have dominion over the animals and plants of the world. That basic notion that the world is there for us, and if it doesn't actually serve our purposes, it's dispensable, that has produced the devastation of vast areas of the land's surface. Any problems in the world are the fault of the book of Genesis, according to David Attenborough. You need to bear that in mind, because he's considered a national treasure, you know, in Britain. He's considered such a nice man. He's a gentle, smiling man. And he produces these wonderful programs that everyone loves. And he hates the Bible. He hates the Bible with a smiling face and a gentle voice. But he hates the Bible. He's very different from Richard Dawkins, who hates the Bible with a passion and really gets angry and his eyes burn. You must have seen him. David Attenborough is a gentle form of atheist, but he's nonetheless completely opposed to Christianity and is seeking to undermine what the Bible says. It's very important to understand that. Well, God created a perfect world, a world in which there was no nephesh death. Now that's important. There was no nephesh death in the world that God created. God created a world in which we were to be vegetarians. People and animals were to be vegetarians. It tells us that God made it so that we would eat plants and that animals would eat plants. People have problems with that. They say, look at the Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's got huge, sharp teeth. It must have been a carnivore. Well, I'm prepared to accept that it may have been a carnivore after Adam sinned, because after all, we have plenty of carnivores today. But it wasn't created a carnivore, because all animals were created to be vegetarians. Now, actually, I can't even prove to you anyway that Tyrannosaurus was a carnivore. I don't know. I think it might have been. I'm prepared to accept it, but I don't know. There are plenty of animals with huge, sharp teeth today that do not eat meat. For example, if you go to Australia, you'll find the world's largest bat there, which is the flying fox. It's not a fox, it's a very large bat. It has enormous, great fangs in its mouth. Huge fangs, sharp teeth, so that it can rip the flesh off melons. Just because an animal has sharp teeth does not mean that it eats meat. The only fact that you have, I often used to show school children, when I was a school teacher, I often used to show them a fossilized Tyrannosaurus tooth, and I'd say, what can you tell me about this tooth from a Tyrannosaurus? And they'd all immediately say, it's a meat eater, you know, and all that. You can't tell that from the tooth. All you can tell is that this animal had big, sharp teeth. That's the only fact you've got. Now, it might have eaten meat, because I think animals did start to eat meat after Adam's sin, but they were created to be vegetarian. We were created to be vegetarian. I am not a vegetarian, incidentally. I'm not a vegetarian. I had some animal for breakfast. Very nice animal. salted grilled pig meat, I think it was. Very tasty. I enjoyed that. Now, I'm sorry if you don't like that. If you're a vegetarian, I respect that. That's fine. But I believe that we were allowed to eat meat after the flood because it says in Genesis chapter 9, God allowed us every moving thing to be meat. Every moving thing. You know, I took my children to a branch of a well-known burger chain the other week, and their products do contain every moving thing, I'm told. And it's okay, therefore, for us to eat them. Every moving thing is to be meat for us. But originally, God made us to be vegetarian. It's interesting, by the way, that not every land animal is mentioned in the Bible. Have you noticed that? You look in the book of Genesis and you'll find there are some significant animals missing. And what's the main group of animals that's missing from the book of Genesis? Yes, you guessed it. It's the cat. The Bible does not mention cats in Genesis. That's what you're expecting me to say, isn't it? So, when were cats created? Answer, they must have been created on day 6. How do I know that? Because it doesn't say that cats were created on day 6. It doesn't say anything about cats. Well, cats are land animals, therefore land animals were created on day 6, so cats must have been created on day 6. Now, you know I'm teasing you. The main one is, of course, the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs. That's what you're expecting me to say. Why doesn't the Bible mention dinosaurs? Well, I can tell you when dinosaurs were created. They were created on day 6 because dinosaurs were land animals. Land animals were created on day 6, so dinosaurs were created on day 6. But why doesn't it mention dinosaurs? It's very easy to understand why. The King James Version was translated in 1611, and we still use a lot of the words in all other versions even today. They're very much influenced by the King James Version. But the word dinosaur wasn't invented till 1841. It's interesting that that word was invented because people had started to find large fossils of extinct creatures. And the reason why the word dinosaur was invented was in order to have a word to describe these large extinct reptilian type creatures. So when people start to worry about how did the dinosaurs die out, I think they're really worrying about something that doesn't exist, because the word dinosaur was invented to describe things that had clearly died out. But it wasn't invented till 1841. That's 230 years after the translation of the King James Version. Now, the point is that there are other words that are actually newer than the word, they're older rather than the word dinosaur. For example, if you look at a copy of Webster's Dictionary from 1828, you'll be able to find the word computer, locomotive, and rocket in that dictionary. Of course, a computer wasn't the sort of thing that I'm doing this presentation on. A computer was simply a counting instrument of some sort. An abacus would be a computer, something that you compute with, or even someone who computes. But the word existed, but the word dinosaur didn't, because it wasn't invented until 1841. So it's no wonder that it's not there in the Bible. That, of course, is the reason why the word email isn't in the Bible. Have you noticed that? Paul's second email to the Corinthians. See what large fonts I use. It doesn't happen. The word email is not there because it's two newer words. Similar, the word dinosaur is two newer words. But is there any word that ought to have been translated as dinosaur? Well, I would say there is. The Hebrew word tannin is translated in the Old Testament, in the King James Version, by the word dragon. Dragon. Now, isn't that interesting? We can go further. The Hebrew word saraph is usually translated in most places in the Old Testament as fiery flying serpent. Fiery flying serpent. There are legends about dragons and about fiery flying serpents from outside the Bible. I think that those legends are people having seen dinosaurs. I think that the dragons are probably more or less mostly land dinosaurs, and that the seraphs may be some of the flying dinosaurs, though maybe some of the dragons were also flying dragons as well. Maybe there's some crossover there as well. The dragons of old legends are probably dinosaurs, and it's interesting that some scientific documents from before 1841 describing some of the fossils that had started to be found in Victorian times of these giant reptiles that they hadn't thought of a name for yet, they actually named them as dragons. And they used that word in the scientific literature prior to 1841. You can go into the British Library and look up the information, and it's there. Scientific documents using the word dragon. Of course, they won't like to admit that today. but it's there. You can dig it up, and it exists. Dragons are probably dinosaurs from history, and that indicates that people have seen them. And there's so much more. You know, when I do talks about dinosaurs, I could go into this at length, and I simply don't have time to do so because we're running out of time in this session. But there is so much we could say about dragons, and it's a wonderful subject to get into. A very interesting animal is described in the book of Job, in Job chapter 40. It's called the behemoth. The passage concerned reads like this: "Look now at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword." This is a description of a very large animal. But if you look in some editions of the Bible, you'll find a footnote, and the footnote suggests that the animal might be a hippopotamus or an elephant. Now, you do need to remember at this point that the footnotes in the Bible are not inspired. The text is inspired, but the footnotes have been put in by people subsequently to try and help you understand things. Sometimes their footnotes actually do not help us to understand, but hinder us considerably. And this is an example. This large animal is first of the ways of God. It must be the biggest animal that Job is likely to have seen on land. So it's definitely an animal that he's seen. We're talking about an animal that has a tail like a cedar. That sounds like a pretty big tail. But if you think about the tail on a hippopotamus, you'll know that a hippopotamus has a very small tail. If you look at the rear end of an elephant, then you'll find that that has a very small tail. Of course, I have heard some people say, well, maybe it wasn't talking about the elephant's tail, it was talking about its trunk. But if you honestly think that the people who wrote the book of Job could not tell the difference between an elephant's trunk and its other end, then you have a pretty dim view of the intelligence of the people who actually wrote these things. It's actually more sensible to think that this is an animal that did have a very big tail. And I would suggest to you that the most likely candidate would be a sauropod dinosaur, one of the largest creatures that ever lived on land. A large animal like that would not have any predators, so it would not be afraid of the sword of man, maybe. In fact, even a meat-eating animal, if Tyrannosaurus was a meat-eater, and by the way, there is some question over that, but if Tyrannosaurus was a meat-eater, it would have had great difficulty in tackling a full-size and active sauropod dinosaur, like a Diplodocus or something of that sort. And people certainly wouldn't have been able to tackle such a creature, and yet it was clearly a plant eater, because the passage says that it ate grass like an ox, like a herding animal. So our suggestion then is that this is actually talking about some sort of large sauropod dinosaur that Job must have been familiar with in order for God to tell him about it. God saw everything that he'd made, and it was very good. So there was evening and morning and the sixth day. That's the end of the creation week. And it looks like we've come to the end of day 6. And when we read at the beginning of chapter 2 that day 7 started, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he'd done. So we've got a 7-day cycle. We've got a week defined, and it works in our heads. It's the only time scale we saw that is non-astronomical. God has finished his creation, and he set it down for us as a pattern for us to follow. That's why we have the week. That's why we have the week, and that's the fourth commandment mentions that particular point as well. God's finished his creation. We've come to the end of day 6, but chapter 2 of Genesis expands on day 6 and talks about what God did with man. And that's what we're going to need to do and to look at in our final section. So thank you for listening.
Do you need the tools to defend your faith? Visit our websites for up-to-date content. Attend one of our live events. And shop online at creationstore.org. We are Creation Today.